May 18th, 1190, Anatolia. Frederick Barbarossa, 68 years old, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. He stood with 10,000 starving men, facing 40,000 Turkish warriors in a city that had never fallen. By sunset, the city burned, the Sultan fled, and Anatolia was broken in a single afternoon. This is how an aging emperor won the most impossible battle of the Crusades. By every rule of medieval warfare, this battle should not exist. 10,000 men do not attack 40,000. Exhausted armies do not assault fortified capitals. Old emperors do not gamble everything on a single afternoon. Wars like this are lost before they begin. And yet, here in the heart of Anatolia, all three rules were shattered. Because Frederick Barbarossa did not fight wars the way others did. He did not fight to survive. He fought to end them. Frederick Barbarossa was not reckless. Recklessness belongs to youth, to men who confuse noise with strength. Barbarossa was something far more dangerous. He was experienced. 40 years of war had carved discipline into his bones until hesitation no longer lived there. He had crushed rebellions that tore empires apart from within. He had broken kings who believed crowns made them untouchable. He had survived betrayals that ended dynasties. Every campaign stripped something away. Illusions, mercy, impatience. What remained was judgment, cold, measured, unforgiving. At 68, Frederick Barbarossa had nothing left to prove. No throne to secure, no legacy to chase, and that made him lethal. Men who fight for glory can hesitate. Men who fight for survival can panic. But men who fight with nothing to lose do not blink. When the Third Crusade began, younger monarchs chose the sea. Ships, supplies, safety. They would arrive intact, but late. Barbarossa chose the land, straight through enemy territory. Not because it was easier, but because time mattered more than safety. Every day saved now was blood not spilled later. Speed was not arrogance. Speed was strategy. For 2 decades, Anatolia belonged to the Seljuk Turks, not because they were stronger than the West, but because they understood something the West did not. Method. The Turkish way of war was not dramatic. It was relentless. Horse archers, endless mobility, constant pressure. They struck without warning and vanished before retaliation. They did not seek decisive battles. They sought exhaustion. Night raids without rest. Poisoned wells, burned grain. Arrows from nowhere. Men fought shadows. Horses died before they charged. Western armies did not lose in Anatolia. They dissolved. No Western force had crossed it alive in living memory. The Seljuks believed this was not coincidence. They believed it was law. Time was their greatest weapon. Every day an enemy marched, he grew weaker. Every day the Turks waited, they grew stronger. They believed patience was invincibility. They believed exhaustion guaranteed victory. They believed Frederick Barbarossa would break, like all the others. Barbarossa watched them closely. While his army suffered, he observed, the same distances, the same attacks, the same withdrawals, again and again and again. Confidence had hardened into habit, habit into routine, and routine into predictability. The Seljuks believed no Western army could endure Anatolia long enough to threaten its heart. They had never faced a commander who understood that endurance was not only physical, it was mental. Barbarossa did not measure war in miles gained. He measured it in assumptions destroyed. Every step forward broke what the Turks believed was possible. Every day the army survived tightened a noose they could not see. They were fighting the war they knew. Barbarossa was fighting the war that was coming. This was not youth against age. This was experience against certainty. A man who had survived 40 years of war against an enemy who believed the outcome was already written. The Seljuks trusted time. Barbarossa trusted preparation. And when those two beliefs collided, Anatolia would learn a brutal truth. Time does not belong to those who wait. It belongs to those who act before certainty hardens into fate. 100,000 men entered Anatolia. Only 15,000 came out, not defeated in battle, not routed in panic, destroyed by the march itself. The Crusader army crossed into Anatolia as a moving city of steel, banners flying, armor gleaming, confidence intact. They believed the danger lay ahead. They were wrong. The danger began the moment they stepped inside. Water was the first enemy. Wells were poisoned overnight. Streams fouled without warning. Men drank anyway. Some died screaming. Others simply collapsed, their bodies giving up before their minds understood why. Food was next. Villages burned before the army arrived. Granaries emptied. Smoke rose where meals should have been. No enemy in sight. Only absence. Only silence. Night brought no relief. Turkish riders came in darkness. Not to fight, but to deny rest. Arrows struck tents. Horses screamed. Shadows vanished before swords were drawn. Every night, no rhythm, no safety. Sleep became a memory. Men marched half awake, driven forward by fear of stopping. Then came the sun. Armor turned into ovens. Men collapsed mid-step, locked inside steel that trapped the heat. No wounds, no blood, just bodies failing. Horses died daily, not in battle, but standing still. Once proud war horses folded beneath themselves, eyes empty, tongues blackened. Their corpses lined the roads like mile markers. Commanders counted losses each morning, not after battles, after marches. Men gone, horses gone, supplies gone. The numbers told one truth. This army was being erased. Senior nobles begged Frederick Barbarossa to turn back, to retreat to friendly land, to save what remained. They spoke of prudence, of honor, of survival. Barbarossa listened and refused, because while others saw destruction, he saw method. The same raids, the same distance, the same timing. Night harassment, day withdrawal, again and again and again. This was not chaos, it was routine, and routine is predictable. While his army suffered, Barbarossa watched. He measured how long the Turks stayed within bow range, how far they withdrew, how confidently they assumed collapse was inevitable. They were not adapting, they were repeating. And repetition, in war, is a weakness wearing the mask of strength. By the time the Crusaders reached the mountains beyond Anatolia's interior, barely 15,000 remained. Not the strongest, the hardest. Men who had endured hunger, thirst, heat, and fear, and were still marching, still holding formation, still obeying orders. What remained was not an army. It was a blade. And ahead of that blade stood Iconium. Iconium, the heart of power. Iconium was not merely a city, it was the heart of Turkish power. Triple walls, 30 feet high, 10 feet thick, 5,000 defenders, months of supplies. It had never fallen, not to siege, not to assault, not to desperation. Control Iconium, and Anatolia fractures. Lose it, and Turkish authority collapses inward. The Seljuk Sultan understood this, but he believed something else even more strongly, that the Crusaders would never reach it intact. He believed exhaustion would finish the work, that starvation would succeed where arrows had not. That time itself was his ally, so he made a decision that felt safe, logical, certain. He divided his forces, part to hold Iconium, part to shadow the Crusaders, and the main army, 40,000 strong, to wait, to strike only when the Christians finally broke. Why risk battle? When collapse was guaranteed, it was a decision built on history, on everything that had always worked, but it assumed one fatal thing, that Frederick Barbarossa was fighting the same war as everyone else. He was not. The trap closes. Dawn broke on May 18th, 1190. 10,000 Crusaders remained combat ready. 2,000 knights, armor battered, horses skeletal, but alive. 8,000 infantry, men who had marched through hell and were still standing. Ahead, 40,000 Turks marching fast. Behind, nothing. No retreat, no relief, no tomorrow. Military doctrine was clear. Withdraw, delay, survive. Frederick Barbarossa chose attack, not because he was desperate, but because desperation was what the enemy expected. And expectation is a vulnerability. The Seljuks believed this morning would end the campaign. Barbarossa knew it would decide it. This was the moment suffering became leverage, where endurance turned into weapon, where certainty would be shattered. The march through hell had not destroyed his army. It had refined it, stripped it down, hardened it. And now, with Iconium ahead and annihilation behind, Frederick Barbarossa prepared to do the unthinkable. He would not escape Anatolia. He would break it. At noon, 500 men would decide the fate of Anatolia. Not 5,000, not 50,000, 500. Before that moment arrived, Frederick Barbarossa did something no sane commander would ever do. He split his army. 3,000 men were ordered to march directly toward Iconium, not to hide, not to delay, to walk, openly, toward a city that had never fallen. 7,000 remained behind, turning to face the Sultan's main army, outnumbered, exposed, standing on open ground. By every calculation, both forces should be destroyed. This was not bravery. This was defiance of doctrine itself. His commanders protested immediately. Veterans who had survived decades of war called it suicide. They spoke of annihilation, of history condemning such madness. Barbarossa listened and overruled them all, because he understood something most commanders never learn. War is not decided by numbers, but by expectations. And expectations, once shattered, turn into panic. The Turks believed the Crusaders were finished. They believed starvation had already won. They believed this morning would end the campaign. They could not imagine that an exhausted army would choose to attack. They could not imagine that 3,000 men would walk straight at Iconium's gates. That impossibility was the plan. The smaller force moved first. At the edge of dawn, 3,000 Crusaders stepped forward. No concealment, no hesitation. Turkish scouts watched in disbelief. Were the Christians insane or desperate? Either way, they reported exactly what Barbarossa wanted the Sultan to hear. The enemy is breaking. Inside Iconium, the garrison commander faced a choice. Ignore the approaching force and risk siege preparations, or ride out and crush them immediately. Pride decided for him. The gates opened. Turkish cavalry poured out. Confident, fast, eager. They expected fleeing men. They found formation. Bait. As arrows filled the sky, taunts echoed across the plain. The Crusaders did not run. Shields locked. Ranks closed. Discipline held. Men who had marched through hell stood their ground. Because exhaustion teaches one thing perfectly: how to endure. At Iconium, the garrison cavalry charged. They expected panic. Instead, they slammed into steel. Infantry formed tight squares. Spears bristled. Crossbows targeted horses. And behind them, 700 knights waited. Not moving. Not reacting. Waiting. The garrison attack slowed, then stalled, then tangled into confusion. Momentum vanished. And confusion is death waiting to happen. 2 miles away, Frederick Barbarossa watched dust rise on the horizon. The Sultan's army was approaching, 40,000 strong, fresh, confident, certain. Everything was moving exactly as planned. The Turks believed they were closing a trap. They were. They just did not realize who had built it. At exactly noon, everything exploded. Trumpets sounded. The Crusader center opened, not in retreat, like a door. And from within emerged 500 men who had not yet fought. The Imperial Guard, fresh, fully armored, mounted on the last strong horses the Crusader army possessed. They had been protected, preserved, hidden, for this moment. They formed a single shape, a triangle of steel, the iron wedge, a formation designed for one purpose: to punch through anything that stood in front of it. The ground sloped gently downward. Barbarossa had chosen it deliberately. Gravity would do the rest. The wedge began to move. Slow at first, measured, then faster. Hooves struck earth in unison. Armor caught the sun. The sound built, not noise. Thunder. Turkish cavalry pressed forward, expecting collapse. They closed distance, exactly as Barbarossa wanted. There was no room to maneuver, no space to wheel away, no time to react. The wedge accelerated. 500 men and horses, each carrying the weight of steel. Training, discipline, not courage. Physics. When the iron wedge hit, it did not stop. Lances shattered. Bodies flew. Lines disintegrated. The Turkish formation, built for movement, collapsed under impact. Momentum became massacre. The Turks had fought wars of exhaustion. They had never faced a war of impact. They had never faced an enemy who turned patience into a weapon and discipline into a hammer. In seconds, certainty cracked. In minutes, confidence evaporated. And across the field, men who believed victory was inevitable began to run. Frederick Barbarossa did not shout. He did not cheer. He watched. Because he knew the truth every great commander learns. The battle is not won when the enemy starts dying. It is won when the enemy realizes the story in his head is wrong. At noon, 500 men rewrote that story, and Anatolia began to fall. This was not courage. This was not faith. This was not destiny. This was physics. 600 pounds. That was the weight of one night, man, armor, weapon, before the horse was counted. Now add the horse, another 1,200 pounds of muscle and bone. Now multiply it 500 times and set it moving at 30 miles per hour. This was not a charge. It was a collision. The Seljuk cavalry had no space to breathe, no room to turn, no distance to escape. They had pressed too close, exactly as they had done 100 times before. But this time, there was no empty space waiting behind the arrows. There was steel, and it was accelerating downhill. The iron wedge hit, and the Seljuk line did not bend. It shattered. Lances punched through light armor like paper. Horses were knocked sideways, then crushed beneath falling bodies. Men trained for speed found themselves pinned, trampled, broken. Momentum did what courage never could. It erased resistance. This was not bravery. Bravery hesitates. This was inevitability. Once the mass was moving, nothing could stop it. Not skill, not numbers, not belief. The Seljuk formation, built for motion, collapsed under impact. In seconds, cohesion vanished. In minutes, the field turned into chaos, and chaos spreads faster than fear. One man turning to run becomes 10. 10 becomes 100. 100 becomes an army dissolving in real time. Veterans who had never fled before looked over their shoulders and saw something impossible. Not an exhausted enemy, not a retreating line, but renewed aggression. That was the moment the battle was lost. Not when men died, but when the story in their minds broke. The Seljuks had believed exhaustion guaranteed victory. They had believed numbers were enough. They had believed this enemy would collapse. Instead, the enemy had changed the rules of reality. When the Sultan's banner fell, everything ended. Not slowly, instantly. Standards were more than symbols. They were anchors. And when that anchor vanished, nothing held the army together. Veterans fled. Elites dropped weapons. Orders vanished into noise. What had been an army minutes before became thousands of men trying to survive the same moment. Frederick Barbarossa charged personally at 68, not from safety, not from distance, from the front. His presence was not symbolic, it was infectious. Men who had survived hell followed a man who refused to die quietly. There was no mercy. This was not chivalry. Chivalry requires time. This battle allowed none. Wounded men were ridden down. Fleeing soldiers were cut apart. Infantry advanced methodically, killing without pause. This was not a duel. It was extermination. The Seljuk army broke completely, and then it ran toward Iconium. Iconium falls. They believed the walls would save them. They were wrong. As fleeing Turks poured toward the gates, crusaders poured out, two currents colliding, thousands trapped between stone and steel. No escape, no formation, no hope. By evening, Iconium burned. Streets ran with blood. Warehouses emptied. Defenders vanished into alleys or died where they stood. A city that had never fallen collapsed in hours, not by siege, not by patience, but by shock. An empire that had ruled Anatolia for decades was humiliated in one afternoon. Not weakened, broken. The Seljuk Sultan fled, his army gone, his capital burning behind him. What had been certainty at dawn was catastrophe by sunset. This was not a victory of numbers. This was not luck. This was the moment medieval warfare changed, the moment discipline met mass, the moment preparation met certainty, the moment an old emperor proved that war does not belong to the many, it belongs to the prepared. The battle did not end when the last man fell. It ended when the Seljuks realized their assumptions had betrayed them. They had trusted time. Barbarossa had trusted physics, and physics does not negotiate. It does not hesitate. It does not forgive. When mass, speed, and discipline align, history gives way, empires fall, and a single afternoon becomes legend. In 6 hours, the impossible was finished. In 22 days, the man who made it happen was gone. Fewer than 500 crusaders lay dead. Not thousands, not even 1,000. 500. Across the field, the cost to the Seljuk Empire was measured in tens of thousands. Some chroniclers claimed 40,000 slain. Others spoke of 20. The truth lies somewhere in between, but the meaning does not change. This was one of the most lopsided victories in medieval history. An empire shattered in an afternoon. The field outside Iconium was unrecognizable. Bodies carpeted the ground so thick that men could not walk without stepping on the dead. Broken lances lay snapped like kindling. Armor, once polished, once proud, now crushed inward, bent by forces no man could resist. Blood soaked into dust until the earth itself darkened. This was not a battlefield anymore. It was a conclusion. Inside Iconium, fires burned through the night. Warehouses, once filled with grain, were thrown open. Men who had marched starving for weeks now stood amid wealth beyond imagination. Silk, spices, gold. The treasury of Anatolia, accumulated over generations, was emptied in hours. The city that had never fallen had not merely fallen, it had been humiliated. And at the center of it all stood Frederick Barbarossa, 68 years old, armor splattered with blood. The same man who, at dawn, had faced annihilation. Witnesses said he did not celebrate. He did not boast. He simply watched. Because men who have survived 40 years of war understand something simple. Victory is loud, but survival is quiet. Fathers found sons alive. Brothers embraced in disbelief. Men who expected death found themselves standing in its aftermath. Iconium was taken. Anatolia was broken. The land route to the Holy Land, once sealed by fear, lay open. Strategically, it was everything the crusade needed. And yet, history was not finished. 22 days later, the army marched again. Not toward battle, toward destiny. Somewhere in the rugged lands of Armenia, they reached a river, shallow, unremarkable. No enemy waited on its banks. No arrows darkened the sky. No drums warned of danger. Frederick Barbarossa entered the water. Accounts differ. Some say his horse slipped. Others say the weight of his armor pulled him under. What is certain is this: the man who had survived 40 years of war, who had broken kings, crushed rebellions, and shattered empires, drowned in waist-deep water. There was no battle, no hero's death, no final stand. The emperor who had conquered Anatolia was taken by a river. History has never stopped finding that irony cruel. His death broke the army more thoroughly than any enemy ever had. Leadership vanished, cohesion dissolved, thousands turned back, others pressed on, but diminished. Without Barbarossa, the Third Crusade lost its sharpest edge. Victories would still come, fame would still be won, but never again with the same clarity of purpose. And so Iconium stands alone, not as a campaign, not as a chapter, but as his final masterpiece. The last time Western steel rewrote the rules of the East. Because Iconium proved something that echoes far beyond medieval warfare. It proved that numbers do not win wars. They never have. Discipline does. Leadership does. Preparation does. And above all, the courage to act when retreat feels inevitable. Frederick Barbarossa did not win because he had more men. He did not win because he was younger. He did not win because fortune smiled. He won because, at the moment certainty hardened into arrogance, he dared to break it. Empires fall not when they are weaker, but when they believe they cannot lose. The Seljuks believed time was on their side. Barbarossa believed time could be stolen. In one afternoon, he proved himself right. Iconium was his last victory, and his greatest lesson. History does not belong to those who wait. It belongs to those who dare and act before certainty turns into fate.